Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to another event of the Balmain Institute. As always, we appreciate your decision to join us tonight, as we know there are many choices available to you now, particularly as some of the restrictions on our movement have been lifted. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. To enhance your enjoyment of the evening, we ask that you keep your microphone on mute for the entire evening. If you unmute yourself, it is likely to interrupt our speaker's presentation. Additionally, if you find the icon on your server that indicates the type of picture on your screen, the speaker view will focus on our speakers. The gallery view fills the screen with shots of everyone who is logged in. The speaker view is better and makes your enjoyment of the evening better also. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat and we will ask the speakers your questions at the end of the presentation. Please keep your questions short and to the point. We'd like to thank everyone who has so generously donated to the Balmain Institute. As you know, presenting these evenings involve costs, and as a not-for-profit volunteer organization, we rely on your generosity to meet our expenses. So we thank you very much for your continued support of these meetings. The Balmain Institute acknowledges that we meet on the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the lands in Balmain and Birch Grove. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. May we always walk these lands gently and in peace. May we actively support the struggle of First Nations people for constitutional recognition and the enactment of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. I would now like to invite Margaret Vickers to introduce our speakers for the evening.
Thank you, Mo. Moving toward the final months of 2021, the Balmain Institute is looking at what happened to women in Australia over the last several months in terms of policies and actual outcomes. What's happened in terms of equality, justice, and protection from sexual abuse and violence. We began 2021 on a high note. The pandemic of 2020 appeared to be behind us. Strong women like Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, Chanel Contos, and Saxon Mullins had stepped forward, demanding change, pointing to the prevalence of sexual misconduct in schools, in workplaces, in sporting clubs, and even in Parliament. In March, more than 100,000 men and women rallied for gender equality and justice outside Parliament House, and there were many thousands in addition to that around the country. The Morrison government introduced a new Women's Cabinet Task Force. The Jenkins inquiry was announced. A National Women's Safety Summit was to be held in September. Legislation was under consideration that might offer relief to affected women in the form of paid domestic violence leave. 2021 did not turn out the way we had hoped, and the Delta variant was not the only problem we faced. We're privileged tonight to have two outstanding feminist human rights lawyers with us who will help us review what has been happening in this space. It is my pleasure to welcome Edwina and MacDonald, who is Deputy CEO of the Australian Council of Social Services. Edwina has, for 2 decades, driven change on social justice, human rights, and gender equality, and has worked in government, university, and community sectors. Alison Aggarwal is the Director of Policy Advocacy and Research at Chief Executive Women. She has also carried significant roles promoting gender equality and human rights in the federal government, the Australian Human Rights Commission, and in community legal centres, as well as through international development projects and with feminist movements and organisations across the Asia Pacific. I believe you two have worked together from time to time. So tonight you plan to engage in a conversation with each other as you help us to understand how women in Australia are faring. It's over to you, Alison and Edwina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate that introduction.
Yes, thank you also from me. It was such a fabulous introduction, and also just a great joy, I think, for Alison and me to have this excuse to work together and come together on this topic, which is very dear to both of us. I might just also echo your acknowledgement of country. I'm on Gadigal country, and it was such a beautiful acknowledgement. I share that call for us to walk with First Nations people and to support their calls for change, including the Uluru Statement. We're not focusing a lot on issues that are facing First Nations women tonight, but we're very conscious of those issues, and we'll at the end come to some other calls to action around that as well. I think I'm going to hand over to you, Alison, now to kick us off on sharing your reflections around the progress around gender equality this year and where we're at currently.
Sure, thanks, Edwina. And can I just echo how lovely it is to see everyone who's registered and attending on this cold and wintry night in New South Wales. I hope everyone survived the storms. I also want to acknowledge the lands that we're gathering on, the traditional owners of the lands. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, so pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today as well. And also just want to say, I mean, that was a fantastic introduction from Mark in terms of what we have seen over the course of this year. And there was probably two sorts of themes that came out of that. One was the sort of the sense of promise that something was going to be done. That there was going to be an inquiry, that there was going to be change, that there was going to be, these things were going to be looked at and dealt with. So there was a sense of promise at the beginning of this year that really came out of some very strong and strident and almost palpable kind of anger and frustration expressed by women and men and other genders as well, just around the level of inequity that is continuing to persist and goes to the core of our institutions and our communities. And I think looking back now across the last 6 to 7 months, what struck Edwina and myself was really the vacuum that has now been left behind from the lack of those promises being fulfilled with many respects, and also the sense of frustration still exists. I mean, I think we only have to look at some of the pictures that we saw this week in New South Wales of male leaders drinking beer in pubs to the exclusion of women and families and any sort of diverse kind of reflection of the community, to just recognise that once again we continue to see the levels of inequity, the gender norms, the exclusion, just perpetuated again and again and again. And I think that frustration is really just simmering under the surface at the moment. So what we wanted to do today was to maybe just also explore some of the voices and the issues that maybe haven't been as prominent over the course of this year in that context. As Edwina mentioned, First Nations women with disabilities, rural and regional women, particularly migrant and refugee women and women of colour, LGBTQIA+ women. There's been a lot of these voices that haven't had a lot of airspace this year, despite the deep frustrations that exist across all those communities. And one sort of group of people in particular that we think it would be worth highlighting this today is really around women who are living on the margins of poverty or in poverty, women who are homeless, women who are dealing with domestic and family violence, because I think it's the voices of those women that often get left out. And one of the sort of threads that we'd like to take today is to understand some of those issues, not just from an individual perspective, but to understand how the structures that are in place at the moment, how they perpetuate and enable those situations to occur. So what change is required at a structural level to really make a significant difference? So I might throw to you, Edwina, if that's useful at that point. You can see we've worked this out so smoothly.
Seamless. It's seamless, absolutely seamless. Yes, no, look, Alison, and I think as in the introduction, I work at ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service, and our focus there very much is on. Oops, sorry, I've just got a little visitor. Good night.
Good night. I just want to see if you were cuddle.
Okay, I have to keep talking. Yes, also juggling my own care arrangements, as you can see. Yes, our focus is on ending poverty and addressing inequality. And we've been particularly taking a focus this year on what's going on for women living in poverty. As many of you may know, we've got Anti-Poverty Week coming up next week. It starts on Sunday. And there's been a focus around that, also on what's going on for women experiencing poverty. So I might just take us through what the picture looks like, and then some of the changes we've seen that have impacted on that, and also some of the positive and the negatives of that as well. So if I just start with sort of setting that scene around what's the story for women who are living in poverty. So what we know is that women comprise the majority of people living in poverty and receiving social security. They make up more than 50% of the people who are receiving social security. The situation for single women in relation to poverty is worse. We know that almost half of the children that live in single parent households are living in poverty. And that's 3 times more the number of children who live in coupled families. And these households are predominantly led by women. And the situation is dire for older women, with older women being the fastest growing cohort of people experiencing homelessness. And by the age of 60, we've got 34% of single women in Australia are living in poverty. And this year we've had, as Alison has said, a lot of focus on women's safety. We've seen the brave women who have been telling their stories. We've seen a National Women's Safety Summit. But within that, there hasn't been a lot of focus on what's the connection between economic security and women's safety. So what we know there is that there's a connection between experiencing domestic violence and financial hardship. Women who have been the victim of severe partner abuse experience financial hardship at more than triple the rate of other women. Socioeconomic inequality and discrimination are key contributors to making violence worse. When women have a lower social or economic status and power, or they're treated as less worthy of respect, they're more likely to experience violence. And women on low incomes can be deterred from leaving violence simply because they don't have enough money. And disturbingly, 1 in 5 women return to violent partners because they've got no financial support or nowhere else to go. And we've seen some research, independent research that was undertaken for the Everybody's Home campaign recently that's estimated that the lack of long-term social housing is leading to around 8,000 women a year returning to violent partners and around 9,000 women a year becoming homeless. So what this tells us is that when we think about women's safety, we need to be addressing women's economic security. We need to be ensuring that women have an adequate income and that they've got a roof over their heads. It's feeding both into a contributing factor to violence as well as a barrier to leaving violence. So if I move on a little bit more to something positive about how we can change this situation for people, and we have changed this situation. Last year, you might recall, something really amazing happened. Overnight, the situation changed for so many women and for people living in poverty. And this happened when income support was increased by $550 a fortnight with the introduction of the coronavirus supplement. We saw that with an adequate income above the poverty line, it made such a difference for so many people just struggling to survive. Now, I wanted to share some stories from women of the difference that this made, the tangible difference that it made to their life. So I'll just bring up my screen to share that with you now. So I'll read these stories out to you as well, because I'm conscious that not all of you will have a big screen. Some of you may be watching on an iPhone, for example. But what we saw last year was a whole lot of people coming out and just sharing what this extra $550 a fortnight meant in terms of the realities of their life. And I'm just sharing, I went to this Facebook page, 550 Reasons to Smile, that we're set up as a collaboration with the National Council of Single Mothers and Their Children. And I just actually pulled the most recent stories about the implementation of about the impact of the supplement. You can go there and you can find, there's so many stories that are like this, but we've got here this story from Jessica, that $550 has given me and my daughter the opportunity to buy a laptop for homeschool learning because of the COVID restrictions, and given me the chance to do online TAFE and Zoom meetings with Relationships Australia. It's helped me to get my kids a swing set we've been trying to get for years. My son 5 and daughter 8 love it. Could never imagine actually affording this for my children. We've heard from another woman. An old gas heater died, and thankfully to the $550 supplement, I was able to go and purchase a new one straight away to keep my new baby and 2 other children warm at night. One a severe croup. I normally would not have had that money. Very thankful. And then another message. For the first time in years, I can pay all the bills and buy food. I have no overdue notices. I've been able to do some maintenance to my extremely rundown car. I've been able to buy myself and children new shoes. So these stories are telling us that simply with an increase to income support that brings that to above the poverty line, people are able to afford the very basics needed to lead a dignified life. We're talking about heating, we're talking about clothing for children, we're talking about access to medicine, to essential health. And the other thing that we saw was that reports from domestic and family violence services that really drew back this connection between economic security and women's safety, that the income, the additional income was making a real difference, both for women's experience of violence and also their ability to leave violence. And when surveyed workers in that sector said that 78% of them said that maintaining that level of income was extremely important to women's safety. And so with that change last year, we saw how so many of these problems could be addressed by increasing the income support to an adequate level that's above the poverty line, that respects people's dignity. That was a good news story, but I'm sure many of you as engaged citizens will be aware that the coronavirus supplement's no longer in place. And so when that supplement was withdrawn last year, what we saw were these really heartbreaking stories from people around what that now meant for them, what that drop of income, the loss of income, the withdrawal of that amount meant. So we've got these stories here from Lisa. When we received COVID support, I spent what I was given on mental health support. When it was stopped, I could no longer afford it and had to discontinue it. Now it's a struggle once again. And then from Ashley, I had to go without at least 7 meals in order to afford a haircut. Seeing a medical specialist was now out of the question, let alone a dentist. I had a couple of friends who provided me with some food so I could pay the rent. So sorry, just stop the screen share there, bring you back again. So we saw that the impact that changed, that it is possible to change this situation and to have real impact, and also that heartbreaking situation of what happened when that was rolled back. And many of you will be aware that we've now got a different version of crisis payments, the COVID disaster payments, and they're currently in the process of being rolled back. But one thing we've actually seen with them, which is interesting and disturbing, is that they've had a gendered impact, that more men have received COVID disaster payments than women. Men make up almost 2/3 of the disaster payment recipient. And that's despite the fact that 80% of the job losses in Sydney have affected women. And so while women continue to be overrepresented among people receiving income support payments, they've received the least support from the COVID disaster payments, and we're now seeing those payments being rolled back. We've also got at the moment legislation before Parliament that will extend the waiting times for access to payments for migrants, including for family tax benefits, and these will also overwhelmingly impact women. So much so that the Parliament's Human Rights Committee has expressed concern about equality for women and children with this legislation. So we're seeing these are policies that are not targeted at men or at women, are having a disproportionate impact at women and are leaving women and many people living in poverty in really dire, unacceptable situations. So I've painted a pretty sad picture here about what's happening for women with the lowest incomes. And I'm going now to pass back to Alison to lay out for us what's going on for women in that overlap between care and work, an area that, as you could see from my little visitor before, is one that I experience myself in different ways.
Thanks, Edwina. I think it's useful to really have highlighted what level of impact, both positive and negative, those kinds of payments can make. And a lot of these people often are coming in and out of work as well. And that sort of insecurity has its own dimensions. And so I think that's one of the reasons why one of the calls that are going to be made is very much for increasing job seeker going forwards, particularly as we see the reduction of crisis payments. It highlights the need for increased job seeker across the board. But just understanding the gendered impact of that, I think, is really useful in that sense. So I just wanted to share a little bit about how that picture of difficulty for people, particularly women in the lower socioeconomic kind of brackets, gets heightened when you bring in and overlay that with their care responsibilities as well as their work responsibilities. And I can see on the line that we have today probably many people who this is not news to. For example, I can see even Meredith Edwards is online. So hi, Meredith, lovely to see you. But I just wanted to flag, I'm recognizing the sort of vast experience in the room tonight around these issues. So to try and not sort of speak to the converted in some sense, I just thought I'd share an angle of how that care and work picture is playing out by sharing with you recent research that came out this week, in fact, by the SDA. So that's the Shoppies Union. I don't know how many people saw that, but I think that's a really fascinating piece of research that's come out. And what it really highlights is they looked at the experience of work and care amongst workers in the retail sector, which covers probably about 10% of the working population. It's quite a large sector. And it's highly female dominated, particularly in those roles that at the lower pay end. And one of the real issues that they were raising was that there's a lot of part-time work in the sector, but that part-time work only has about 8 hours a week guaranteed work. The rest of your hours are made up in casual shifts. And that difficulty that presents for anyone, particularly mothers who have caring responsibilities for children or other family members as well, to be able to juggle their lives and drop everything at a moment's notice, to be able to take up that almost shift work that happens, makes it almost impossible. They have to basically choose between the shift work and their caring responsibilities. And when they can't choose to take the work that's being offered to them, they're often penalized for not taking that work at that point in time. So that creates a really, really difficult scenario. And when we're talking about women in that situation who aren't earning very much anyway, like it's not, great rates of work at that point in time. They're very grateful to have a job, but the level of pay is not sufficient to be able to, every time they don't take a shift, they don't get any more pay. There's only those 8 hours that they have guaranteed. So I think that really highlights the extreme difficulty that places a lot of women in. And what was really interesting about the research was the level of stress that puts on that woman who's constantly having to juggle. Can she do that shift? Can she take her kids to sports practice? Can she pick up the kids after school? And how that works. And it's really interesting how the gender norms also infiltrate in this space, to the point of, if it's predominantly women working in that sector and the men are working in other sectors such as construction and trades and other industries, where they don't have that option to be able to participate in the caring so much. What does that mean in terms of structurally? What kind of society are we creating in this space? And how can we actually, what kinds of initiatives and changes do we need to make in the policy settings so that we aren't creating these kinds of situations? So I just thought I'd share that a little bit with you, and we can follow that up in comments as well and discussion afterwards as well. So I noticed that there's a couple of comments coming through and a couple of questions coming through, so that's great. But I'll just flick back to Edwina for this point in time to take us through the sort of, what does that mean around the sort of the budgeting process and the economic process that we have in place?
Thanks, Alison. And yeah, I think, the budget is one of the major structural, economic drivers, but ways we can structurally change where we're allocating money, what we're doing with it. And I think if we cast our mind back to May, back to the federal budget, and I have to say, it feels like an eon ago for me. I feel like this last 3 months has almost been a year. But it was only, 5 months ago. And at that time, that budget was in the context of, a perceived gender problem, perhaps for the Prime Minister and for the government, a perceived need to deliver a women's budget, or a budget that was for women. And we saw for the first time the government delivered a new women's economic security statement. And look, there were some welcome initiatives that were targeted at women through that budget. We saw funding for domestic violence and sexual assault services and grants, women's legal services, consent education. But that funding was significantly less than what had been identified as being needed for the sector. And I think we had this moment as people who were, at budget lockup, caucusing in lockup and afterwards across, people working on these issues of, being excited, oh, there's something in there, and then that feeling of, but it's so far actually from what's needed, and is that what we're going to be satisfied with? And so to kind of look at it in that sense, I think what the budget didn't deliver, and it had the opportunity to do, but it did not meaningfully deliver on a need for structural and cultural change. It was a budget really that fundamentally locked in gender inequality because it failed to address what our tax system is doing, what our employment system is doing, what our superannuation systems are doing, and how they're stacked in favour of men. And what we didn't see in the budget is we didn't see a substantial increase to JobSeeker, which we know has a greater impact on women. We didn't see the increase of social housing to labour market programs that are specific to the needs of women, including those caring responsibilities that Alison was talking about. We didn't see an investment in the care workforce to improve pay and conditions for women in that workforce. And we didn't see super reform to address women's lower retirement income. And while we saw some child care reforms, we didn't see reforms to meet those on the lowest incomes, the needs of single mothers, and the needs of First Nations communities. But what we did see was tax cuts. And tax cuts with this message, I think, tax cuts, there's something for everyone with a tax cut. There's, it's always something for everyone with a tax cut. So I just want to test that a bit here. So I've got another slide which I'll share with you now. Here we go. So from a low income perspective, what we can see is that there's definitely not something for everyone with tax cuts. Tax cuts do not help the people with the lowest income. So this graph is showing you the level of income for the different quintiles, the level of tax and government benefits for the different quintiles of income. So the lowest 30% don't benefit in any way from tax cuts. So this idea that, well, there's something for everyone with tax cuts just doesn't play out with these statistics. And what we know is that tax cuts have a gendered impact because they advantage people already in the workforce and with the highest income. And we know there's a gender pay gap, that women's income is lower than that of men. So just laying that out, quite simply, tax cuts will have a greater benefit to men. But if we look at what's going on with the stage 3 tax cuts, so these are the ones that are legislated to commence in 2024. And if they proceed, we're going to see a situation where men will save 5 times as much money as women with those tax cuts. So that's just a really stark difference of what's going on when you apply a gendered lens to what would be seen as a neutral policy. And then if we actually look at the costs of the major budget measures in the budget, we can see just the contrast and the disproportionate, I guess the extent to which that spending just overshadows the spending in other areas, including the areas that were identified for women's economic security. I think it's something like 30 times in the figures. So while we saw this women's economic statement in this budget, we can see that what actually played out with it was really entrenching that gender inequality. And what we know also is that when we see tax cuts like this, what it's doing is also down the line, we're going to be seeing future budget cuts to essential services because it's cutting our revenue that's paying for those services. So Alison, I'm just going to throw back to you now. If you can talk through, you talked about this need for structural and cultural change, and I've spoken to how that's just sorely missing from this year's budget, despite all the focus and all the advocacy around women. So what does it take to change all of this?
Yeah, no, good point, Edwina. And I think it's fascinating when we see graphically the disparity represented like that. It's no wonder there hasn't been any change this year, when structurally that's the level at which the investment is being put into these things. And I think one of the key things that people have been calling for, and it's been very difficult to get traction on this, but one of the key things that people have been calling for is to really have a proper gender-based budgeting. Exactly, Meredith. She's just put it up in the comments.
Right on cue.
Yes, exactly. So in terms of really applying a gender lens and a gender analysis throughout the decision-making processes and at the key points of the decision-making process of the budget, because all parties to date have focused more on reporting what has happened in the budget and allocate and identifying what's been provided that will benefit women and will benefit men, but they haven't really incorporated that into the actual decision-making process of policy development and budget development. So unless we apply it right up front, where we can really get a solid understanding of how is this really going to benefit? How is this really going to create the change? How is this really going to reduce the segregation, reduce the gender pay gaps? We aren't going to get anywhere. So just that idea that we need to move on from budget statements. Budget statements don't cut it. And all budget statements show is the extent to which the inequity is being entrenched across the budget. So that's why there's a really, really important piece there around calling for structural change in terms of gender responsive budgeting. And just to flag as well that a lot of people are actually calling for it to be undertaken with an intersectional lens as well, meaning that to highlight what would that mean for First Nations women? What would that mean for women with disability? What would that mean for lower socioeconomic women as opposed to other women? So I think that's a really key space. I'm just conscious that we are cutting into our discussion time, but Edwina, do you want to just maybe flag some other areas of potential change that we could draw on?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll keep it fast so we can get to some questions. And I mean, I think as you alluded to at the start, there's been a lot of frustration collectively, personally around the opportunities and the great highs of some of the fabulous advocacy we saw from women, and then some of the lows of the disappointing government responses. And at times that can get me down, I think. And then I have these moments, particularly, in the current kind of pandemic context, with everything feeling a bit much, I'll step back and, I'm going to find the positives. And I think when I reflect on that and where we're at, we can see, and many of you I know will have a much longer span or a view of this than I have, and a lot of experience, deep experience, but the conversations are shifting and that public responses are shifting too. And in that sense, when we were talking about the different areas of work, I always feel like when I'm working in this space that what we're actually doing is just building on the work of so many incredible women that have come before, and we're standing on their shoulders. And there's this great joy in working with women on these issues, because there's just this really strong culture around alliances and collaborations. And we've seen that younger women are coming out and, particularly talking about sexual assault so powerfully, and people are coming in and women are coming in to support that work and advocacy. But also that we've come to a place where spaces have been created by the work that's come before us, where women feel safer to speak out than they might have previously. And I think, Annabelle Crabb talked about that in her documentary series recently, about the experiences of women that have come before and the challenges they faced, and how the ability to speak about these things has really shifted. So when we look at it like that, I think we've made so much progress, and we are moving somewhere. And I think in the budget context this year, there was some really strong gender analysis and strong collaboration. And it was a noticeable difference from previous years where we'd had a few key people and organisations focusing on it. But this year we saw this broad engagement across the issue. And that there's this sense, I think, that the advocacy is growing and building and continuing to get stronger and stronger. And I think all of that gives me hope in moving forward in achieving change in this area.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of actions that people can take. Because I think it's always good to sort of finish off with what can I do? Do you know what I mean? So what can I do to make a difference in this space? Because one of the things we want to avoid is that sense of it's all too much and it's all too hopeless. So and I think some of the comments have flagged that, there is an election coming up, a federal election coming up. And I think that does provide a unique opportunity to be advocating within whatever sphere of influence we each have for some of these issues to be on the discussion table, on the agenda, to be taken seriously. So I think that that's one I would encourage everyone to do. There's a couple of specific actions. There's some petitions around Anti-Poverty Week that we will share with you after the event. There is
in the chat now.
So Edwina has usefully put that in the chat now. There's also one that we wanted to really flag, which is about support Change the Record, which is for it's First Nations women calling for an independent First Nations women's safety plan that is above and beyond the national safety plan that's being developed at the moment. I would also suggest that the movement around COP26 and the procedures and the responses to climate change that we're seeing, I also see that as a really important opportunity to harness, to make sure that some of these structural issues that we're talking about around gender are actually addressed at the beginning of that process, rather than those inequities being perpetuated in whatever responses are developed for climate change and for COP26. So that would be the other space that we would encourage people to take action in. We might stop there, Marg and Mo, if that's useful at this point, and go into the discussions, because I think a number of people have mentioned a couple of points which we can definitely take up.
I was listening to what you were saying about poverty and its relationship to domestic violence, and how if you really don't have, you're really down on your uppers and have nowhere to live, if you don't live with this violent man, you go back. So really, in a sense, this reform to income support becomes a solution that's a broader one. Would that be the way to go?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That there's many reasons why we should be reforming income support and ensuring that people have an income that brings them above the poverty line. But we saw it really clearly with the coronavirus supplement last year, that it provided a way out for people who needed it. There wasn't this, but how will I afford to live if I leave question, because there wasn't an adequate basis, a safety net that's there that ensures that people and women in that situation would have enough to afford the basics.
Now, Jude Stoddart wrote in relation to that comment on the Shop Distributed Allies report that women are only getting 8 hours of contracted work and the rest is all casual. She said, this sounds like a move towards something which is beloved in the UK, 0 hours contracts. Have you got any?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, I was just trying to get the contact details for the shift for Kate. She had requested that be put into the chat. I might ask Edwina to follow that up. I wasn't able to do it in that quick moment. And if we don't get it in this moment, Kate will make sure we send it out. Michelle from the Balmain Institute will send it out for you. Yeah. So just in terms of that, I think, yeah, the 0 contact hours, 0 hour contracts are a real problem. It's a real feature of the working poor, you know, like, and one of the women who responded to the SDA research as well was like, I have a job and I'm one of the few lucky ones that have a job, but I'm the working poor because it's not a livable wage. So it's a nonsense in that sense, because yes, you're working, but it's, even if it's not 0 hours, even if it's just that 8 hours, it's still not a living wage. So it's really interesting that you've got to look at it in terms of not just a minimum wage. So because a minimum wage guarantees you a certain amount of, you know, money, dollars for the hours you work. But if the hours you work aren't at a minimum level, then you're not able to achieve a living wage. So I think that's really what we need to be making sure that there is a strong call for, is that sense of a living wage. And I think that's where it becomes very interesting to talk to business as to how they're structuring these employment contracts, because to what extent does a casualized 0 hours contract work for them, but not for their employees? And so how can we shift the conversation so that it becomes an obligation of theirs as well to make sure that whatever employment there is, it's at least a living wage.
One thing if I might just add to the kind of the comments I made before, which Jude's helpfully just flagged in a chat with me, but what I didn't mention, of course, was that I was talking primarily about the situation for women on income support, but of course there are another category of people who are in a situation where they don't have access to income support. So we've got people seeking asylum who can't access any kind of income support. And so that situation for them and the kind of intersection of domestic violence is even more dire for them. And then we're seeing a further intersection coming in on that in terms of this current COVID context and how to support people in that situation around accessing essential health. I mean, we know, for example, that vaccinations are available to everyone. You don't need a Medicare card, but that is not commonly known. People are quite rightfully scared of turning up, are being asked at vaccination hubs where the Medicare card is, for example. And so there's the kind of multiple intersecting problems that are being faced by people who've essentially been cut out from government supports in this country.
Gosh. Meredith Edwards made this comment: we need gender-based budgeting and all women's groups should demand it prior to the next election. Now, I'm not sure how, I mean, Meredith's just there, but I'm not sure how gender-based budgeting, apparently it has been done in the past. Do either of you want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a really good point, Meredith, because I think none of the parties have really come to the party on this one. So the Labor Party hasn't, the Liberal Party hasn't, none of the parties that I know have actually come to the party on this. But what we have seen is, for example, in Victoria, they did, as part of their budget, introduce a dedicated section within their Treasury department and invest money in that section to undertake gender responsive budgeting. And so they've not only committed to doing it, they've committed money to a section that can do it and training for that section to be able to do it. So that's the kind of commitment you want to really see it happening in practice.
That's fascinating. Look, I'm just going to make an appeal to both of you, Alison and Edwina. This has been recorded and it will be on the Balmain Institute site for anyone who wants to see it. But if you can write to Michelle and our tech assistant and tech professional, I should say, and put in these web addresses and references, that would be terrific. And then that gives us a basis for all working on the issues you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And I haven't been able to find that. There's a form link for joining the shift. I think it will ask you how you heard about it, so name us. And we'll give that to Michelle to share afterwards as well. I'm not for putting up on the website, but certainly for sharing with the group here. Yes, but I failed in my quick search of my email to find the correct form for that one.
And I've sent out a text message requesting that, so I should get back something on that soon.
Okay. All right, terrific.
Now, we've talked a little bit before about paid domestic violence leave, which in fact some employers provide. Is there any state in Australia that is legislating this as a universal requirement, or is it basically just up to employer by employer?
I think somebody was saying something then. No? Okay. I think the issue with that is I think that the businesses have been quite good. So the business sector has been quite good on this in terms of providing employer-based leave for 10 days or more for domestic and family violence. But I think what's needed is really for this to be introduced at the federal level and at the national level under the Fair Work Act, because it shouldn't be a matter of playing roulette where you shouldn't be able to, your access to domestic and family violence leave shouldn't be limited to whether you're lucky enough to work for one of those employers that provides it or not. It should be available to everyone who is potentially experiencing those situations. So that's why the call has been made for it to be introduced under the Fair Work Act, which would build upon the great work that the businesses are doing to be able to make sure that that's accessible by everyone. And that is not yet been enacted at the in the Fair Work Act. And it's at that level that we need it at, in my opinion.
And I think, Alison, that goes to your point earlier about just the need for these to be structural changes. And so rather than doing this organisation by organisation or sector by sector, that what we need to see is a structural systemic change. And I think we talked a bit earlier about before the boom about how we're seeing that play out in the COVID context as well, and leave that might be required there. And the Australian Services Union have done this analysis that shows that, so we're in a model of opening up that's based on the Doherty model, it's, nationally, and that part of that model is the TTIQ, the trace, test, isolate and quarantine. So we can expect that we'll continue to have periods of isolating and quarantining as part of this model. And what the Australian Services Union analysis has looked at is that for the community services sector, for the care sector, a sector that we know is predominantly women and predominantly women on lower pay relative to other sectors, that there's this intersection of people who will be, through their work, out in the community, at greater risk of being exposed to people who have COVID due to the nature of the work, and due to the nature of the work, likely to be in that very close proximity, close contact form of exposure. So bringing that all together, what we're seeing is that, you know, that it is likely that people, and predominantly women in the care services area, will be being asked to isolate on a more regular basis because of their work. And then if you factor that in with the likelihood that as women, they've also got care responsibilities at home and their children may be in school also being exposed, that we can see that what we're heading towards is this, I mean, there's essentially a workforce challenge as well as an inequality challenge, because if you're in a situation where you're being forced to isolate and you're not getting, either you're not getting paid for it, or what you're doing is using all your other kind of leave. You're using all your sick leave, you're using all your annual leave, all your long service leave. So in a way, structurally what we're doing is removing. It's like you come in and say, okay, we just, annual leave, we're taking that away now. Sick leave, you no longer have it. So removing that leave by stealth, it'll create really precarious work situations for women in that role. And so the kind of the structural systemic answer for that is to introduce a TTIQ leave at a national level through the employment standards that requires there to be the form of paid TTIQ leave, and that it should be done through a workforce standard, not a welfare measure, in that it is actually essentially it needs to be a workforce right to support the employment and work in a predominantly female dominated sector.
Okay, I had one question, sort of changing the topic a little bit. I wonder how much this becomes, women's poverty becomes an intergenerational issue. That is, the women having trouble supporting their children and all the rest. How much does that influence then the children's ability to move into decent work, or are they going to be more likely to be subjected to poor working conditions and some kind of poverty also? So we find another structural element of it becoming passed on within families.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we know is just there's unacceptably high level of children currently living in poverty, and that it's something that urgently needs to be addressed, because we know that flows onto so many areas of life, that, you know, that the social determinants of health, that living in poverty impacts your health. And we know it impacts COVID. We know that that people are more likely to die from COVID if they're living in poverty. 4 times more likely, I think, is the statistic. So I think it does really just highlight the pressing need to address this now, and to address it for children and families now, to ensure that we're not continuing to have an impact on essentially people's futures, as well as bringing those in that situation now in supporting a more dignified life.
And I think that's even more true for specific groups, because I think if you look at the sort of the intergenerational trauma, as well as dispossession, as well as poverty, that has followed certain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, for example, that is clearly intergenerational. And I think that's why it's really important to understand things like JobKeeper and these kinds of payments, not as safety nets so much, but as foundational blocks that are needed for people to be able to secure lives of dignity. You need it to be not just, you need to be able to have sufficient amounts that you can actually not just live from hour to hour, day to day, because that you can't build on that. You actually need a decent level from which you can actually create a life of dignity for you and your children, and without that, you do have these intergenerational trauma sort of impacts. And I think that will be interesting to see as well with the refugee and asylum seekers, ones that are being completely denied any way of getting on their feet once they're here, like especially for migrants, 4 years of no assistance whatsoever. It's like You know,
Oh.
you're set up to fail. And what impact does that have on their children? How can they lift out of that? I think is something that we will really see play out in the years to come.
Mm. Yes, well, certainly that is a pressing issue, and it speaks to a cruelty and of policy that's totally unnecessary, given the wealth of the country. I'm afraid we need to probably close. I'm sorry, it's somewhat of a grim thing, but it leaves us with a lot to think about, you know, and it's not just a matter of, oh dear, poor women aren't getting well treated. It's a cause really for a concerted action to make things better, and not only for us, but for the disadvantaged groups, refugees, First Nations people, people with disabilities. I mean, it's an issue about which there should be a unified voice for all women. I want to thank you and Edwina for presenting these ideas and issues tonight, Alison and Edwina. It's been a really good evening, a wonderful evening to have this opportunity to discuss these issues and to get a broader perspective on what's going on and some clue as to what needs to be done. Thanks to everyone who's attended. We appreciate your hanging in there and joining us tonight. Thank you again. So for now, good night and stay safe, everyone.